Today we are going to briefly discuss regulation of renal calcium excretion and calcium extracellular concentration. Calcium is very important and its level must be kept normal within normal range, and there are a lot of factors which keeps the calcium concentration normal in the plasma. And one of the factor which influence the calcium level in the plasma is the renal handling of calcium. Now, a normal calcium level is around 2.4 milliequivalent, and decrease in calcium level is known as hypocalcemia, and it can lead to hypocalcemic tetany. And increase in calcium concentration is hypercalcemia, and hypercalcemia can lead to cardiac arrhythmias. Normally, the calcium in the blood is active. Only 50% of calcium is active. The remaining is bound. 40% is bound to proteins, and 10% is bound to non-ionized anion, like phosphates, etc. Now, there are a lot of factors which will increase the active or inactive calcium in the blood. For example, acidosis or the increase in hydrogen ions in the blood will lead to decreased binding to proteins. Decreased binding to proteins will lead to increase in the active form, while alkalosis, on the other hand, will lead to increased binding to protein. So when increased binding to protein occurs, it leads to decrease in the active form of calcium, and it can altogether lead to hypocalcemic tetany, as happens in hyperventilation. Someone who is breathing in hysteric tetany when occurs in someone who is breathing very fast. Now they actually remove the carbon dioxide from the blood. Alkalosis occurs, and the calcium binds the calcium level, the active level of the active form of the calcium decreases, and it can lead to hypocalcemic tetany. Now, calcium mostly is excreted in feces. 90% of calcium is excreted in feces. Around 1000 milligram of calcium is ingested daily, and around 900 milligram is excreted in feces. So it is important to know that most of the calcium is removed from the body through feces. Now what happens is that calcium is stored, 99% of the calcium is stored in bones. It is deposited in the bones. Less than 0.1% is in the extracellular fluid, and around 1% of calcium is in the intracellular fluid. Now, what happens when there is a decrease in the calcium concentration in the blood? When there is a decreased concentration in the blood, there is decreased activation of calcium sensing receptors of the parathyroid gland, and it leads to increased release of parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone, it comes to the bones, and it increases the level of calcium by resorption of calcium from the bones, because bones are acting as a reservoir of calcium. When the blood level of calcium increases, it leads to increased activation of calcium sensing receptors and decrease in the secretion of parathyroid hormone, and then stopping the resorption of bones and leading to deposition of calcium in the bones. So bones are a reservoir of calcium, but they are not the ultimate source. They also can get depleted. So calcium has continuously to be taken in. Now, to maintain the level of calcium, the parathyroid hormone, which is released from the parathyroid glands, it has three main important roles. When it is secreted, it leads to resorption of calcium from the bones and trying to maintain the level of calcium in the blood. Similarly, it activates the vitamin D, and vitamin D then helps in reabsorption of calcium from the intestine. And finally, parathyroid hormone also acts in reabsorption of calcium from the kidneys. Now we have discussed all these things, but our remaining lectures will be focused on this thing, the renal handling of the calcium, or the regulation of renal calcium excretion and extracellular calcium concentration. We will discuss the remaining parts of the calcium cycles in the relevant chapters, but in this chapter we will focus on renal handling of calcium. So that's the beginning, and in the coming lectures we will discuss this thing in detail.